The candle in Gideon Ashcroft's study had burned nearly to its base, and the hall outside was dark enough that Philippa could see the thin strip of light beneath the door from 20 feet away. She had her valise in her left hand. Her traveling cloak was buttoned to the throat. The house was absolutely still, the kind of stillness that exists only in the hour before dawn, when even the servants have not yet begun to move. And she had been walking toward the front door when she heard his voice through the study wall. Not raised, not directed at her. 6 words, spoken in the exhausted, private register of a man who believes himself alone. She stopped. She stood in the dark corridor and heard them land. "I am sick of your face." He had not known she was there. She understood that in some part of herself that remained clear and analytical even in the first terrible seconds after hearing them. He had not known. The words had been aimed inward, at himself, perhaps, at the reflection of the marriage he saw in his own window glass, at whatever had kept him awake in that study until the candle burned low. She understood all of this. She set her valise down on the stone floor of the corridor, straightened her glove, and opened the study door. Gideon was standing at the window. He turned when the door opened, and whatever he had been expecting, a servant, the housekeeper, his own conscience-given form. It was not Philippa in her traveling cloak at 4:30 in the morning, with the look on her face that she wore now. He said nothing. She crossed the room without waiting for him to speak, passed him entirely, and went directly to his bureau. She opened the second drawer. She knew which drawer. She had always known which drawer, and removed the household ledger. She carried it to the desk, opened it, and read aloud. "The Carver family's lease renewal," she said. "Outstanding since the 15th. The Northfield drainage. Your steward has written twice, and you have not replied. Mrs. Holt requires a decision on the cook's winter stores before Thursday, or she will purchase at market rate, and the cost will be 30 shillings higher than it needs to be." She turned a page. "The Pendleton boy's apprenticeship fee. You agreed to it in September. He's waiting." She turned another page. "The east wing gutter. If it is not repaired before the first hard frost, you will spend 4 times the amount in the spring on the ceiling beneath it." She closed the ledger. She set it on the desk in front of him, flat, precise, exactly centered. He had not moved. He was standing exactly where she had passed him, and his face held the expression of a man who has been handed an object he does not know how to put down. "I'll help," Philippa said. The words came out cold and precise and entirely without sentiment. They were not an offer of forgiveness. They were not a declaration of loyalty. They were a statement of fact, the same tone she had used when reading the ledger, the same tone her father had taught her to use when presenting accounts, the tone that meant, "Here is what is true. Here is what needs doing. Here is what I am capable of. And here is the limit of what I am offering you." She picked up her valise. "Philippa." She was already at the door. He moved. She heard it, 3 quick steps, and she felt the air shift beside her right shoulder. His hand closed on nothing. She did not look back. The door swung shut behind her on its own weight, and she walked down the corridor toward the entrance hall. And she did not stop, and she did not turn. And by the time the first gray light touched the east-facing windows of Ashcroft Hall, her carriage was already on the Bath Road. Gideon stood in the study holding the household ledger. The candle beside him guttered once and went out. He stood in the gray pre-dawn dark with the ledger in both hands and the sound of the closing door still present in the room. And he did not set it down for a long time. 3 days passed. They passed for Philippa in the rented rooms on Pulteney Street, where she had taken a sitting room with a good north-facing window that gave clean, even light across a writing desk. She unpacked methodically, arranged her books along the windowsill, and spent the first morning doing nothing at all except sitting in the chair by the fire with her hands in her lap. By the second morning she was working. She had brought 2 books from Ashcroft Hall, both on property law, both annotated in her own hand from the years she had spent managing her father's estate. She had brought her correspondence file. She had brought her own ledger, the one she kept separately from the household accounts, where she tracked what she privately thought of as the shape of things. Patterns in payments, timing in agreements, the small discrepancies that emerged when numbers were examined not in isolation, but in sequence. On the 3rd morning, a letter arrived. It bore the seal of Thornwood, Crace and Associates, Solicitors. Philippa read it at her writing desk with both hands flat on the surface, and her breathing even and controlled. Her cousin Rupert had moved. The debt claim named her portion as co-owner by jointure. Her legal response was required within 14 days. The instrument was described in language that was precise and confident and contained, she noted immediately, 2 dates. She set the letter aside. She opened a fresh ledger, the 3rd she had brought from Ashcroft, and she began to write. She wrote the instrument's claimed dates in the left margin. She wrote Rupert's known financial position in the column beside them. She wrote the dates of her father's final estate transactions in the 3rd column, drawing from memory with a precision that would have surprised anyone who had known her only as the Duke of Ashcroft's quiet wife. She noted that the 2 dates in the instrument did not align with each other, and she drew a small circle around each one and connected them with a single horizontal line. At Ashcroft Hall, Gideon read his copy of the solicitor's letter at the breakfast table, alone. He read it twice. He set it down. He sat for a long time looking at the wall. Then he took out a sheet of paper and wrote 1 line. I did not know he would move this quickly. If you are willing, I would prefer to face this together. He did not add to it. He did not explain himself. He sealed it and sent it to Bath. Philippa received it the following morning. She read it once. She set it on the corner of her desk, not in the fire and not in the correspondence file. Then she took out a fresh sheet and wrote to the solicitor at Thornwood, Crace and Associates, confirming her participation in the proceedings as co-owner by jointure and requesting the original instrument be made available for examination at the first committee meeting. Then she took out a second sheet and wrote to Gideon. She wrote 1 word. When? The first committee meeting at Lincoln's Inn was set for the 3rd week of November. The morning was gray and cold, and the rain had been falling since before dawn in the steady, purposeful way that London rain falls in November, not dramatic, simply persistent. Gideon arrived at 9:45. He had brought his solicitor, a man named Farwell, who had handled Ashcroft estate matters for 11 years and who spoke in the careful, measured cadences of someone who had learned that the most dangerous thing a solicitor could do was speak quickly. They were shown to the committee room. Rupert was already present, seated on the far side of the central table with his own solicitor and a clerk. He rose when Gideon entered, inclined his head with perfect courtesy, and sat again. At 10:05, Philippa walked in. She was wearing gray wool, dark at the sleeves, with a collar that sat close at the throat. She carried a leather file of the kind that solicitors used. She sat down opposite Gideon without looking at him, set the file on the table, and opened it. Rupert's solicitor, a man named Crace, compact and watchful, looked across the table at Gideon with a particular expression of a man asking a question without words. Is she here with your authority? Do you want her removed? Gideon looked at Philippa. She was reading the first page of her file with her pen uncapped and her attention entirely on the document in front of her. She had not asked for his confirmation. She had not looked to him to speak. She is present as co-owner by jointure, Gideon said. She speaks for herself. Grace blinked. The committee chairman, a gray-haired man named Aldous, who had seen 30 years of debt hearings, made a small notation and said nothing. Philippa looked up, not at Gideon, at Grace. I would like the original instrument produced, please, she said. I have the committee's copy. I would like to examine the physical document. Grace produced it. Philippa took it, set it beside her own notes, and examined it for 45 seconds without speaking. Then she placed her finger on the second date, the registration date, and said, "This date does not correspond to the county registration record. I have written to the county office, and they have confirmed the filing. I am requesting discovery of the original debt deed, not the instrument derived from it." The room was quiet in the particular way that rooms become quiet when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. Rupert watched her from his side of the table. His expression was pleasant and entirely unreadable. He said nothing that conceded anything, and he said it with considerable charm. The meeting concluded at 12:30. The committee granted Philippa's discovery request, set a second meeting for 3 weeks hence, and adjourned. In the street outside Lincoln's Inn, the rain was still falling. The carriage had not yet been brought round. Philippa stood on the step with her file under her arm, and Gideon, without speaking, lifted his coat above her shoulder, at arm's length, not touching her, and held it there against the rain. She stood beneath it. She did not thank him, and she did not move away, and they stood like that in silence until the carriage appeared at the corner. The second committee meeting produced Philippa's counter-documentation, a county record obtained through the discovery request, showing that the debt instrument had been registered 6 weeks after the date written on its face. Grace examined the record, asked for time to respond, and received 3 weeks from the committee. Rupert's expression did not change. Outside on the steps, Gideon said, "You found that in 4 days." 3, Philippa said. The 4th day I spent writing the letter requesting the Carver lease renewal, since no one else had done it. He had the grace not to respond to that. They traveled together to the Carver farm that afternoon. The visit had been arranged by Philippa before the meeting, and Gideon arrived at the carriage without being invited and without explaining himself. She did not ask him to leave. The Carver farm was 3 miles from Ashcroft Hall, set back from the lane behind a low stone wall. The eldest child, a boy of 8 named Thomas, had been ill for a fortnight with a chest complaint that had kept him in bed, and his mother at his side with the particular exhaustion of a woman who has not slept properly in 2 weeks. She opened the door when she saw the carriage, and her face did something complicated when she saw both of them. "Your Grace?" she said to Philippa. And then, with a slight hesitation, "Your Grace," to Gideon. The child's room was small and warm, lit by a low fire. Thomas was awake and pale, propped against a bolster with the careful arrangement of a child who has been ill long enough to have opinions about his own comfort. He looked at Philippa with a direct assessment of the young and said, "Did you bring the lease papers?" "I did," Philippa said. "They are signed." The child considered this, apparently found it satisfactory, and closed his eyes. They stood at the bedside while Mrs. Carver talked, about the illness, about the physician's last visit, about whether the Northfield drainage would affect the lower pasture where her husband grazed the sheep. She spoke to Philippa the way people speak to someone they trust, to both hear and act. She spoke to Gideon with a careful respect that was not quite the same thing. At some point, while Mrs. Carver was describing the physician's instructions, Gideon's hand found Philippa's. It was not dramatic. He did not reach for her hand with any visible intention. His arm simply moved, and his hand was there, and his fingers closed around hers once, with pressure, and stayed. Philippa did not withdraw. She did not look at him. She continued listening to Mrs. Carver describe the physician's instructions, and her hand remained inside his. And Mrs. Carver noticed and said nothing, and kept talking. On the road back, in the carriage, Philippa did not mention the hand. "Do you have the Ashcroft estate ledgers going back to 1819? She asked. "They are in my locked study," Gideon said. "I will need them." "I know," he said. And then, after a pause, "I'll have them sent to Bath." "Thank you," Philippa said, and looked out of the window and said nothing else for the remainder of the journey. The discovery documents arrived at the solicitor's office in Bath on a Tuesday afternoon in late November, and it was there, in a lamp-lit room with rain striking the single window that faced the street, that Philippa found the deed. She read it once. She set it flat on the desk. She read it again. Her father had gifted her portion to Gideon Ashcroft outright at the wedding. Not as debt resolution, not as settlement against the Thornwood claim. Freely as an act of trust. The language in the deed was plain and unmistakable. Her father had known about Rupert's claim, had known the shape of the debt, and had given everything he could give to the man his daughter was marrying, because he had believed, the deed made this explicit, that Gideon Ashcroft was a man who could be trusted with it. Gideon was seated across the desk from her. She looked up at him. "Who asked whom?" she said. "Was it my father's proposal, or yours?" The lamp burned steadily. Rain moved against the glass. Gideon was quiet for long enough that the quality of the silence changed. It was not the silence of a man constructing a convenient answer. It was the silence of a man deciding to say something true. "It was mutual," he said. "The arrangement was proposed from both sides at the same time. Your father wrote to me in the same week I had written to him." He paused. "But I would have asked on my own. I want you to know that. I was going to write to him regardless." He did not add to it. He did not explain why he had not told her this before, or why he had let her believe, for 18 months, that the marriage had been primarily a financial convenience. He simply said it and left it there. Philippa looked at him. She looked at the deed on the desk. She looked at him again. It was the first honest sentence of the marriage, not the most important thing that had ever been said between them, but the first thing that had been said without management, without the careful architecture of self-protection, without a duke speaking from behind his title. He had said, "I would have asked on my own." And it was true. She could hear that it was true. They sat in the lamp-lit room without speaking further. The rain continued against the window. The lamp burned down slowly, then guttered, and the room went dark, and neither of them moved immediately. Then Philippa gathered her papers, stacked them in order, and rose. She left the room. Gideon sat in the dark for several minutes, his hands on the desk, before he rose and followed. Rupert came to Bath on a Wednesday in December, unannounced. He sat in Philippa's rented parlor with his hat in his hands, and the expression of a man who has rehearsed the scene he is about to perform, and is confident in his preparation. He was, as he had always been, charming. He was her cousin. He had grown up in the same house for 3 years after her mother died, and he knew how to speak to her in a way that acknowledged their shared history without invoking it directly. "I am offering you a settlement," he said. "Your portion returned clear. The debt claim withdrawn entirely. No committee, no further proceedings." He paused. "Gideon Ashcroft made this marriage to resolve a debt he knew about before you were engaged. The debt is resolved. There is nothing left of the practical arrangement that required it. What remains is a question of whether you would like to spend the next 6 months in committee rooms defending a marriage that has already functionally ended, or whether you would prefer to walk away with your portion intact and your independence complete." Philippa listened to all of it. She did not interrupt. "Thank you for coming," she said when he had finished. "No." Rupert studied her for a moment. "Philippa," her voice was even, "the answer is no, Rupert. You may see yourself out, or I can ring for someone to assist you." He left. That evening she wrote to Gideon, "Rupert has shown his hand. We need 3 weeks and the Ashcroft ledgers back to 1819. Gideon did not reply in writing. He arrived in Bath the following morning, not to her door, directly to the solicitor's offices she had been using, on Milsom Street, where she arrived at 9 o'clock to find him already seated at the table with the ledgers stacked beside him and his coat still damp from the road. He had not slept. She could see that. She sat down across from him, opened her own files, and they began. They worked for 4 hours. They worked through the Ashcroft accounts from 1819 forward, and through Rupert's known transactions, and through the timeline Philippa had been constructing since Bath. Gideon could read a ledger, not with her speed or her eye for pattern, but competently. And he asked good questions, and he did not speak when she was thinking, which she found she valued more than she had expected. At 2 in the morning, the solicitor's clerk having long since gone home, Philippa turned a page in the 1821 ledger and stopped. There it was, her father's handwriting, the particular forward slant she had known since childhood, the small looping D he had never lost from his schoolboy script. A payment recorded on the precise date that Rupert's instrument claimed was the date the debt was originated. The payment was not a debt payment. It was a transaction in the opposite direction entirely. A transfer that proved the account Rupert claimed had been open on that date had, in fact, been settled. The instrument's date had been written after the fact. The debt had not existed on the date the instrument claimed it had been originated. Rupert had not simply overstated a claim. He had fabricated one. Philippa set her finger on the entry and said nothing. Gideon leaned across the table and read it. He read it again. He sat back in his chair. "That is fraud," he said. Her answer was quiet and certain. "Yes." They looked at each other across the table in the solicitor's office at 2 in the morning, with the 1821 ledger open between them and the lamp burning low. Rupert's response arrived in the form of a notice published in a London paper 4 days later. The notice stated that the Duchess of Ashcroft had abandoned her husband and her household without cause or provocation, and invited anyone with relevant knowledge to contact the Thornwood solicitor's office. By the following week, 3 letters had arrived at the county magistrate's office, unsolicited, written independently by 3 different tenant families from the Ashcroft estate. The letters detailed, with the particular precision of people who observe carefully and say little until they have reason to say something, the Duchess of Ashcroft's management of estate correspondence during the preceding months. The Carver letter was the longest. It described the lease renewal, the physician's visit, and the fact that Thomas Carver was now recovered and had returned to his lessons. And it ended with a sentence that Mrs. Carver had clearly written herself. She came when she said she would, And she did what she said she would do. And in my experience, that is rarer than it should be. Philippa read the letters when the magistrate forwarded copies to her solicitor. She set them in her file without comment. She went to Gideon that evening with a proposal. "I want the final committee hearing held at the Ashcroft Tenants' Hall," she said. "Not Lincoln's Inn, not London. Here, on home ground, with the families present." Gideon looked at her for a moment, he did not hesitate. "Yes," he said. 43 families, she said. "I know," he said. The night before the hearing, Philippa sat alone in the tenants' hall with her notes spread across the central table and 2 candles burning. The hall smelled of wood smoke and cold stone, and the particular dry smell of old timber. And she had been sitting there for an hour when she heard the door open. Gideon crossed the hall to where she was seated. She did not look up from her notes. He stopped beside her. She heard him breathe once. Then he leaned down and kissed her. Without announcement, without a prepared approach, without anything except the accumulated weight of 3 months of Lincoln's Inn and lamp-lit rooms and a pressed hand at a child's bedside, and 47 letters he had never sent. When it ended, Philippa sat very still for a moment. "That is not an answer," she said. "No," Gideon said, "but it is true." She looked at her notes. She picked up her pen. Gideon pulled a chair from the far end of the table, carried it to the corner of the room, and sat down. He did not speak. He did not offer to help. He simply stayed in the corner of the tenants' hall while she worked through her notes by candlelight, until she gathered the last page and rose, and they walked back to the hall by separate doors and separately reached the morning. The committee convened at 10 o'clock. The tenants' hall held 43 families along its walls, farmhands and their wives, elderly tenants who had lived on the Ashcroft land for 40 years, the Carver family in the front row with Thomas standing very straight beside his mother. The committee chairman Aldous sat at the central table with 2 other committee members. Crace sat beside Rupert on one side. Philippa and Gideon sat opposite, with Farwell at the end. Rupert looked, as he had looked throughout every meeting, patient and courteous and entirely untroubled. Philippa opened the proceedings. She presented the county registration discrepancy first. The 6-week gap between the instrument's stated date and its actual filing, documented and confirmed in the registrar's sworn statement, which she read into the record. She presented the 1821 ledger notation in her father's hand. The original document, brought from Bath under seal, and walked the committee through the transaction it recorded and what it proved about the instrument's claimed origination date. She was precise. She was specific. She did not raise her voice, and she did not use a single word that was not necessary. And the 43 families along the walls listened without moving. Crace rose. He produced the forged instrument as physical evidence and formally asserted its primacy over county records and ledger notations. He spoke for 12 minutes, citing 3 precedents and the instrument's apparent regularity on its face. He was competent and thorough. Rupert watched Philippa throughout with the same patient courtesy he had maintained at every meeting. He had the look of a man who has prepared for every contingency. Then Gideon stood. He did not speak immediately. He reached into the file on the table before him and removed the gift deed, the outright bequest from Philippa's father, made freely at the wedding, documented in language that admitted no ambiguity. He set it on the table. Then he reached back into the file and removed 47 letters. They were still in their envelopes. They were in chronological order, each bearing a date in Gideon's own hand on the upper right corner. spanning 18 months from the week after the wedding to the week before Philippa had walked out the door. He set them on the table beside the deed. He did not open them. The room was entirely still. "I place the deed before you," Gideon said, "because it establishes, in my father-in-law's own hand and before independent witnesses at the time of the wedding, that the portion this instrument claims as collectible debt was given freely and completely 3 years before the instrument's stated origination date. The debt could not have originated when the instrument claims it did, because the asset was already transferred. The instrument is not a disputed claim. It is a fabrication." He paused. His hands were flat on the table. "I place the letters before you for a different reason," he said. "They are not legal evidence. They have no bearing on the instrument's validity. I am placing them here because this hearing is being held in this room, before these families. And I believe they are owed honesty in addition to documentation." He looked at the envelopes for a moment. "I spent 18 months failing to send my wife what I meant to say. I wrote it 47 times. I could not bring myself to send a single letter, because sending them required me to be the man who wrote them. And I was more comfortable being the Duke of Ashcroft in the corridor." He looked up. "The deed beside those letters shows what her father believed about this marriage before I had earned it. I have not earned it yet. I am aware of that. But I want the record to show, in this room before these people, that the failure of this marriage to become what it should have been is mine and not hers, and that it was never for lack of her worth." He sat down. Rupert had no counter to the deed's date. The committee chairman Aldous examined the gift deed, examined the registrar's sworn statement, examined the 1821 ledger entry, and conferred with his 2 colleagues for 11 minutes. He found for the estate. The debt claim was dismissed. Rupert Thornwood was referred to the county magistrate on grounds of instrument fraud, with a full documentary record forwarded under committee seal. Rupert rose from his chair, retrieved his hat, and left the hall without speaking. He did not look at Philippa. The families filed out slowly, the way people leave a place where something real has happened, and they are not quite ready to return to ordinary time. Several stopped at Philippa's side of the table. The Carver family stopped last. Mrs. Carver took Philippa's hand in both of hers and held it for a moment without speaking. Thomas looked at Gideon with the frank appraisal he had applied to everything since his recovery and said, "Will the drainage get done now?" "Before spring," Gideon said. Thomas considered this and nodded, apparently satisfied, and followed his mother out. When the hall was empty and the committee had gathered their papers and gone, Philippa stood in the quiet of the tenants' hall, with the 47 letters stacked on the table before her and the last candle burning down. "I came back for my word," she said, "and for the tenants, not for you." "I know," Gideon said. "I stayed past the first meeting because of one honest sentence in a lamplit room." She paused. "And because of 47 unread letters on a table." "Those letters are yours," Gideon said. "They were always yours. I simply hadn't found the courage to deliver them." Philippa looked at the stack of envelopes. "I would like to read them," she said. He answered without hesitation, "Yes." She gathered them carefully in their chronological order and placed them in her file. She picked up the file. She looked at him once, not the measuring look she had used across committee tables, not the careful professional regard she had maintained through 3 months of Lincoln's Inn, but a look that was simply his wife's face, tired and clear and present. Then she walked toward the door. "Philippa," he said. She stopped, but did not turn. "The east wing gutter," he said. "I had it repaired in October." A pause. "Good," she said, and went out. The following morning at Ashcroft Hall, the study door stood not quite closed. On the desk inside, 2 sets of ledgers lay open side by side, his running back to 1819, and the one she had taken on the morning she left and carried back in her file. They were open to the same year, the pages aligned, and someone had placed a single sheet of notes between them, written in 2 different hands. On the hall table outside the study, a single tray held 2 cups of tea, both still warm. The 47 letters had been opened. They were stacked on the corner of the desk in her order, not the chronological order in which he had written them, but a different order, the order in which she had read them, which told its own story about what she had found inside. The stack was neat. Each letter had been refolded and returned to its envelope. On the 47th, in Philippa's hand, a small annotation had been added at the bottom of the final page, in the precise and particular script she had learned from her father, and used in ledger margins for as long as she could remember. "You should have sent this one first."